Well, we're winding down the year right now, but there's still things to talk about, especially when it comes to Arcane. Season 1 is complete, but there's so much to discuss in terms of how Arcane came to be, and I'm really excited right now to be talking to the casting director for Arcane, David Lyerly. How's it going, David?
Doing great, man. Happy to chat.
Oh, very good. And casting director is your official role on it, yes? So I'm sure you wore a lot of hats like so many people.
Yeah, the casting director and the voice director. So I was
Voice
the one
director.
in the recording session with the actors and actresses.
Awesome. All right. Well, one of the fun things that I've been sort of diving into with everybody as I've been learning about how Arcane came about is just the fact that this was a 6 year long project. And it's kind of interesting to try to piece together like the timeline and when people became involved and how long that involvement took place and how it iterated over the time. So I'd kind of love to hear just from you, like what were what was all the work that you did? Like what did your
Yeah,
role encompass during this time, and kind of around when were you doing what?
right on, man. I joined Riot in 2017, and Arcane wasn't immediately on like my roadmap. Right, I was responsible for League. I was the new VO producer, looking at the champ cadence, the skins, the CG pieces that might feature dialogue. But I kept hearing about that there's a pilot, something that's kind of in the works. And one fateful evening in late 2017, I was hit up by Alex Yee, who was like, "Hey, so we have this thing we're working on. We're playing around with it, and we're in some re-records of the pilot, just sort of trying to get new looks at some of the characters, and wanted to know if I would step in to direct the ADR sessions to help out." Obviously, I was excited, and then ADR meaning you're working with talent to picture. So I saw the quality of the picture and where it was, and I was like, absolutely, I would like to be involved in this if possible. And sort of that's kind of how we all connected. I came on first just as the ADR director, eventually turned into casting the remaining episodes of the series, as well as there were some tweaks to the first episode. So I cast in that episode as well, was the voice director, and also handled things like talent management, like negotiating the contracts, dealing with our responsibilities to the recording studios and the union and stuff like that.
So you were originally doing something very different at Riot. I mean, still in the same line, right? But like trying to figure out like, okay, how do you voice a champion in the context of League where they're saying little lines or like stuff when they attack or whatever, versus a fully voice acted script over the course of all these episodes. I mean, is it like jarring to switch between those two things because they're very different roles?
It's certainly a shift. Anytime we're working on, for example, with a champ, you're working really closely with the designer, you're working closely with the product leadership, with the narrative team, with audio, and you're trying to understand sort of like what activates this wish fulfillment. What is the power fantasy of this character? How would it work in game? How would this character communicate in a way that makes sense for like the player experience? Whereas when you're working on something linear, what you're really working with the creatives is like, what is the story that you're looking to tell? Where the challenge comes in is when you're trying to pull from an existing IP, where players are going to have preconceptions of what these characters should and shouldn't sound like. So those are some of the things that we did a little bit on League, like for example, like the Odyssey trailer that I did. I directed that one as well with the talent, and those are like where you're starting to explore like characters doing more than just talking on the Rift, and like what is that like and how does that feel. So it's a yes, you're right, it is a unique challenge in a different space, but it was one that we were all kind of excited to explore.
When you mentioned sort of the expectations that people have around specific champions, like people had been playing Caitlyn for so long, right, or Jinx or whatever these characters are now, suddenly you have to find something where it sounds like what the champion should sound like. How did you go about that process? Was it just because I think a lot of people have no idea how a casting works for something like a voiced show like this. So, are you just like listen? People are submitting reels or whatever, not reels, I guess, but tapes, auditions, and you're just going through them. What's that process like?
It's kind of that, yeah. So, not entirely dissimilar from interactive, but usually the way it works in voiceover is you go out to the representatives, Sometimes you're going out to what are like the agencies that we work with regularly interactive. So I would always go with them first, being that those are many of our existing relationships. But then, from my time prior to Riot, I was a talent agent. So I've worked with the community of voice talent as well as celebrities at some of the other agencies. And so you start to engage with a few of them as well for some of the bigger roles, just to see what they have. And you're going to either get a bunch of auditions for the roles that you have open, or some suggestions for what are called like producer sessions, where they're like, okay, well, this talent may not audition outright, but they'd be willing to work with the producers for a directed session to see what they have. And usually in most instances, working very closely with Christian and Alex, because we would have an idea of what we thought would fulfill the player fantasy. And then you get things back and you're like, okay, either we need to lean into this more, we need to better define it, or maybe there's an opportunity for an evolution or a pivot. And I think a lot of our champions fell into one of those three categories. Like with a Heimer, it's like, get it right.
Yes.
Like there is a very clear understanding of the way this needs to be, and anything that fell short of that would be a disappointment. Whereas like with some of the others, it took a lot of work.
Was it difficult at all? Because you mentioned Heimer. Heimerdinger in League is just like this goofy inventor guy who's like really quirky, and Arcane on the other hand is this very serious, dramatic, thoughtful show. And so I'm sure it's like, okay, how do we get both this character sound like quirky and interesting, but also not just feel completely out of place in a world where like people are dying and there are like relationships that are forming and falling apart and all that stuff. So I mean, how did you deal with that?
Well, first off, it sounds like you have a really good handle on casting. So if you're ever looking, hit me up. But as it pertains to like Heimer, for example, like we did the first session and we had the in-game voice as a reference point, and we were playing it for the talent. We were looking at the art, and we really had an idea of like wanting to sort of activate the player fantasy from what was in League. But to your point, like when he's talking about some of the more serious topics and dealing with matters of death, or like some of the horrible history that Piltover had, there were moments where like, this feels tonally incongruent, right? And so like, Christian would go back into the lab, or Alex, and they would sort of review it. And they're like, okay, we have to find something in the middle, because while we love the chirpy, goofy Heimer, it's not going to necessarily work tonally with the other characters that we're working with. But we also didn't want to pull him back so far that he wouldn't be recognizable. So like it was constantly threading that needle, and even with the talent being like, well, you're pitching a little bit, or it's getting a little grating, or we're moving into something that we call in voiceover like cartoony. It's losing its ground and feeling authentic.
That's super fascinating to think about. Kind of going to the casting side of the folks that you ended up with. Was there anybody, you had mentioned that you'd worked with people previously. Was there anybody that ended up on the project where you had been like, this is somebody I really want for this role or whatever? You know, you hear oftentimes about in film or television directors that are like, yeah, I have to work, with Leonardo DiCaprio in every movie that I do or something. So I don't know if there was anybody where you either had worked with them previously and you had this great relationship, or where you were like, I know that for this character, this person is going to be able to deliver for me.
It's a really great question. And I like it. I liken it to like Mamet. So like in New York, Mamet had like William H. Macy, among others, like people that he would work with regularly in theater. And I think you gain a lot out of that. And you see that with Watiti, certain across his projects, where, and they're not always going to be the stars, but they're people that are in your ensemble that you just trust and they get you. So like Baby Blanc, who was our Vander, or Dave B. Mitchell, or Mara Juno, Josh Keaton. These were people that play very small parts in the pilot and just sort of one-off roles, but they're also people that have a lot of flexibility with their voice and they're able to do more. And so, I mentioned to Christian and Alex, I was like, hey, they worked really hard with us for the pilot for years as we tried to sort of shape in it and get it to something that would get greenlit and be allowed to move into production. Let's sort of, as a thank you, let's bring them in and let's find roles for them in season one, because some of them didn't make it out of the first couple episodes. So, in that jump in time, just provided an opportunity for us to just fill out the ensemble with people that we love working with and just want to keep working with them. So like Josh, who's our Deckard, was also solo. as he because Deckard didn't have any more to say.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not the spoilers for anyone who's listening and may not have
I
watched.
think if people are watching this, hopefully they've watched the whole thing. But yes,
Right on,
I
man.
I think it's there are also some folks that you ended up working with who have been in very high profile projects and are currently in high profile projects in some cases. So I guess the question is like, how did they get involved in this? Did you know you wanted some bigger names for some of these other roles or some of the bigger roles? You know, how did some of these folks end up attached to the show?
Awesome question, and it's a great opportunity for me to sort of share a bit of like Christian and Alex's philosophy. So it was never an idea that like we need to get names. Rather, it was we have to nail like these roles. So like thinking of Jace, for example, when we originally discussed Jace and we were talking about sort of the opportunity area and what we kind of wanted to do with him for the show, I pitched Kevin Alejandro. It's just somebody who like I was a fan of. I'd been watching him in Lucifer, but I'd seen him since like True Blood. And you know, sometimes as a casting director, that's what it is. You are also a fan, and you're like, actually, I think he'd be great for this. And we did a really big search, so we didn't just land with Kevin right away. It was more that the way Kevin approached the character, he brought like sort of this earnestness that the others didn't. And in some ways, when you're casting, like the talent sort of closes the distance. Like
Yeah.
we'll have an idea in our mind, it's this thing, and then the talent kind of does their thing, and you're like, oh, you know, I could see how we can triangulate and kind of land on something like that. And in many ways, Jace sort of evolved with Kevin. So he's definitely one where early on was like, him, or like Shohreh Aghdashloo, who's our Grayson.
Yes.
You know, Christian was very specific, and he's like, Grayson needs to sound like she can hold her own against Vander. And I was like, what does that mean? He's like, I want a woman with as big of a voice as JB. I was like, okay, that's going to be tough. But in doing a little bit of due diligence, recognizing her as a great fit, and then pitching it to Christian, and it really wasn't even much of a conversation after that. He's like, she's perfect, her. And then we went through the act of trying to secure her for the project. But sometimes that's how casting works, where you sometimes you do an open call. Other times you're like, I really think this person's a good fit. Let's see if we can make it happen.
I don't know if this is a question for you, because I know it leads more towards the animation side. But there have been multiple situations where people within the community have looked and been like, wow, this character looks a lot like their voice actor. So I don't know if that's always a coincidence when it occurs, or if the voice sometimes inspires the design of the individual. Obviously, like with the League of Legends characters, it's a little different because they're already established. But I don't know if you can ever speak to any of that, if it's all coincidental or not.
Shockingly, it is coincidental, but there's something there, right? So, for example, like with Jace, roughly the character model was in my hands when we went to cast. So like we would show it to the talent as a means of inspiration. Usually you put the art up like in the room, like at the top of the monitor, just so they could see it and kind of vibe off what they're seeing. However, we also videotaped all of the performances, the facial capture. So it allowed the animators to use the expressions of the actors as they're in movement. Now, granted, they still did it by hand, so it wasn't like capturing the data from that. But I think in terms of like with Tokes from Mel, there were definitely like patterns of her, the way that she moves and talks and expresses herself with her eyebrows, that I saw present in Mel as a character in the animation. So they're certainly informing it from a performance perspective, but never their likeness one-to-one.
Are there any specific stories you can talk about with regards to either the casting or whenever it came in to kind of direct the voice work that were kind of special moments? Like, I don't know, there's so much emotion in the show, and I don't know if there were moments where you just saw an actor really show up in the way that they needed in that moment that like really shook you, or if there were times where somebody came in and just did a casting for, or tried out for the role, or sent something and you were like, that's it, we got it, it's like perfect. Like, I don't know how often those kind of like storybook moments occur in reality, but if there's anything you can share along those lines.
There's two actually, and they're sort of related. So the first was something that happened in session. So when we were working with Mia for Powder, and we were we were set to record 103. And again, spoilers for anyone watching this. You're warned. You've been warned. I was looking at the scripts for the day and the sides and thinking about, okay, we have Mia coming in. Mia at the time, I don't remember exactly how old she was. I think 11, 12, right around there. If you've seen 103, it's Mia's perform Powder's scene at the very end with Vi. It's very emotional. And I called her mother the night before to see if we could just like have a talk, Mia and I. And because it can be difficult, like in a recording session for voiceover. In live action, you have an entire cast, you're in wardrobe, there's a set. There's a lot of things that as an actor or actress can sort of assist your ability to sort of be in that moment. Whereas like voiceover, you can feel like a fishbowl, like you're in a fishbowl. And it's even harder if you're young and what you're doing is very vulnerable. So me and I talked the night before about what was going to happen with Powder. And more importantly, we talked about like trauma, and we talked about psychosis, and we talked about mental health. We talked about that snap that happens for her. And what was really important for us in the room was that it felt authentic. We didn't want it to feel performative. We didn't want it to feel put on. But more importantly, if anyone had ever had like a traumatic moment like that in their life, that was created like a post-traumatic stress reaction, we wanted it to feel lived in, like there was something about the experience that felt that resonated with them. So we talked about it the night before. We get into the record. We did all the other stuff for Powder for episode 3, and we waited for that at the end. And I was like, okay, here we are. How are you feeling? We kind of dimmed the lights. I asked everybody just to kind of just keep it quiet and just let it be me and the talent. And one of the ways that I direct, I tend to read the other parts in the scene. Sometimes I'll use the voice on tape, but other times it just feels good to just kind of be vulnerable with the talent in the room and just vibe and riff off of them in the scene. Because sometimes they want to take the direction in a different way than maybe we recorded with the other character. And reading with them allows that flexibility. So I was reading Vi's part, and she's obviously reading Powder's part. And we did the first take, and it was really good. And but it felt like we could go further. And so we talked a little bit in between the takes, and I asked her, I was like, look, for the people at home that may have gone through this experience, for the authenticity of it, I want you to not hold back. Like, this is a safe place. Just allow yourself to go to this really dark place, and we will be here on the other side. So we roll up the next take, and she opens with, I think, what we actually wound up shipping. And it hit me so hard that when I was reading Vi's lines, like I was crying as I was delivering the dialogue. And we go back and forth like this. We let it roll towards the end. So she sort of cried, and we just let her keep crying because we didn't know if we may need some wild crying somewhere else. And then when it was done and I said, cut, I looked up, and every single person in the room, like I saw Alex and Brad and Kathy and our engineers, everyone was crying. And that was when we knew, it was like, we think we did something kind of magical. And seeing the player response to that moment was like everything. I still get choked up watching the reaction videos of people react to that moment, just because it sort of puts back in that sense memory of it. I want to open it back up to you. I had the casting version of that, but there may be other questions.
No. I mean, I think it's wild to hear that, especially given, I don't know how many people know. Oftentimes roles that are for younger folks are still performed by people that are much older. And so for you to have that come from somebody who is so young, and especially in relation to the character, and at that same point, like, it just sounds wild that you were able to do that, because I think so many people they just assume something like that would not be possible. So I think it really speaks to her talent that you were able to accomplish that. That is that's wild. You mentioned you had a similar story on the casting side.
Yeah, it would have been Ella. So Jinx was tough. I think, it's a credit to both Christian and Alex that from the beginning, like nailing Jinx and getting the version of her that players would resonate with was so important. But early on, we ran into like a real challenge, right? Jinx, in the way that she is in game, is a celebration of power, right? She is chaos. She is a ADC. She is doing the damage. She has a pretty cool kit, a lot of different variations, and more importantly, just from the art to the video to everything that we'd seen, and that version of Jinx is part of this character. But so was, what we discussed was sort of like the fracturing of her. So after that event in 103, Jinx sort of being, you have the misfit trickster, you have the delusional sociopath, you have the loyal daughter, and you have the scarred little girl. And what we toyed with was the idea that when those aspects of her are present, they are singular and obvious. Meaning, like when Jinx is having a powder moment, you see it, the fragility, the naivete, the innocence. So when looking for that, it was really tough because some actresses could nail like maybe one of the four things that we were looking for, but we needed them all to feel so distinct. And it's a lot to do in an audition, like to be that vulnerable and to kind of like be that pardon the expression, but like to be that wild and crazed in front of strangers, to just go like ham like that. And then when Ella came in, we'd been looking for a while. It was about 2.5 months. And it was through a lead that we had at one of the agencies that we work with, someone that he just signed. And my buddy was like, hey, have you tried her? And so we brought her in for a producer session because she was one of those that skipped the actual direct audition. And what she did the rooftop scene from 106 for the audition for the producer session. And in that scene, all of those characters, those versions of the character are present, and she nailed each one almost from the first take. And I wanted to like hug everyone in the room because I was so scared we weren't going to find her. And it was like such a breath of fresh air because we knew players deserve to have a Jinx that could really excite them, but also one that was right for Arcane, because it's a different story that we're telling with her.
Yeah, that's also a very cool story. Just hearing, because it is true. I think sometimes people just consume the content; they don't necessarily think about how much range somebody must have for some of these characters, especially because in the season, so many characters go through so many different things. There are so many different moments of victory and elation, moments of defeat, etc. And it's just it's probably very difficult, as you said, to find somebody who can just like go through all this stuff. One of the things that is interesting also about the voice work is that there's not a moment, as you said earlier, where like people are all together. You have all these actors playing against each other or whatever. A lot of times they're playing off of you or the recording. So I'm sure that I talked to a couple folks who basically said it wasn't until the premiere and all the stuff that happened around the launch of this thing that everybody was able to be around each other. And so was that interesting for you to sort of see and hear all these voices from the show and people you'd worked with together all coming together?
Yeah, man. Both the night of the premiere and the second night of the Undercity Nights, when they all showed up, it was surreal. I was just sort of like the night of the premiere where we had the entire, like the main cast all standing up there for the picture, and they're standing up there with Christian and Alex. And while they're taking these photos, it's just like remembering all of the experience to finding each of them and going through the records. And that sort of, because Arcane was a labor of love. It was something that came from a place of all of us. Most of the craft leads, having worked at Riot in interactive, were sort of care very deeply, not only about the story, but really, I mean, when you'd ask anyone, like ask Christian or Alex, like, hey, are you excited about, knowing the launch was coming? It was always around, we want to know what players think. We can't wait to see what players think. And so like seeing that cast up there, all sort of connecting with each other, laughing with each other for the first time. I remember saying to Kevin and Harry, as we were, Victor and Jace, as we were walking away from it, I was like, welcome to the family. We had imagined for years, our players will be engaging with you in social. Hopefully you're coming to future Riot events, like recognizing sort of like they are now a part of the future crew as we explore these new stories together.
That's really cool. I mean, I think I got to see how people were receiving them, and it's been neat to see on especially on social media for some of the folks, just how much love that they're getting from the fans. So when you say like, yeah, welcome, it feels like that's probably a very poignant way of putting it. Hey, I just want to open up and to you and say if there's anything that you want to share or anything that you want to say at the end of the interview about this experience and, you know, the fan reception or working with anybody in particular. I just wanted to give you the floor to kind of share anything.
Thanks, brother. I'll say the Sunday after the premiere, the entire, you know, sort of crew, I think we were all like glued to our phones in our beds, just looking at the response. And we were looking at the player response like that, whether it was Twitter, whether it was Reddit, somehow making their way into various league video, YouTube comments about the show. For us, just sort of seeing that reaction was like everything. And it made it all like, I couldn't wait to like jump back in, like, let's start working on 2 now. And even though it was a Sunday, it's like just that idea that I think that the players are smart and they're incredibly perceptive. And the fact that they embraced the subtlety and nuance in the way that we'd hoped that they would, it just gave us such a sort of feeling of hope and excitement about, you know, the future of, you know, working in this space and exploring stories in this IP. So, you know, just thank you for tuning in. Thank you for, you know, sharing the love. Thank you for digging these characters and this story as much as we did. I mean, that their praise and excitement has been infectious, and that's sort of been it. It's been everything, made everything worth it.
David, thank you so much for talking with me today about this. It's been really a pleasure to dive in on all the Arcane stuff, and I'm trying to just pretend that the show is over so that I don't have to worry about how long the wait's going to be for season 2, but I really do appreciate it. So thank you again.
Right on, brother. Thanks for having me, man. It was a pleasure. Of course.
And for everyone else, you can check out the rest of my coverage of all things Arcane right here on my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for watching that interview. I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Alienware. You're looking at this right now and you're like, wow, Travis's camera sure is nice. You know, we've got the sun coming in and all that stuff. No, you're not watching it on an Alienware 34-inch OLED. And so you got to get one of those things. It is beautiful. You would see this thing. It would just, the HD, it's amazing. So please check out Alienware. You can check the link in the description below and be sure to look at their new 34-inch OLED. It is fantastic. I love mine.